The summer of 1856 in South Carolina was heavy with heat, the kind of heat that seemed to suffocate the air itself. Outside Charleston, where the soil was rich with cotton and the economy thrived on human bondage, one plantation in particular stood apart. Its grand facade, with towering columns and manicured gardens, was not merely a home. It was a symbol of dominance, of wealth extracted from suffering, and of a family that believed itself untouchable. On that estate, in the waning days of August, an invitation was sent to a select circle of guests. A midnight banquet, a feast held under candlelight in the great dining hall. To outsiders, it appeared as another display of opulence, a gathering of men and women who believed themselves masters of fortune and fate. But behind the velvet drapes and polished mahogany, something darker stirred. For this meal would be unlike any other the South had ever seen. The table was laid with almost theatrical precision. Silverware gleamed under candle flames, crystal goblets caught and fractured the light, and platters of rich meats and fruits glistened as though meant not for sustenance but for worship. Midnight struck, and the banquet commenced with laughter, clinking glasses and whispered toasts to prosperity. But in that same hour, a shadow crept into the room, a shadow that would linger in history far longer than any toast or cheer. By dawn, half of those who hadn't were dead, their bodies stiffened in grotesque positions, their eyes wide open as if they had witnessed something beyond human comprehension. The others vanished as though the earth itself had swallowed them whole. No tracks in the soil, no signs of struggle, just empty chairs and a silence more chilling than screams. The news spread quickly. Servants whispered of poison slipped into the wine. Townsfolk muttered about betrayal and revenge, pointing to the ever-present tensions of inheritance, land, and politics. But others spoke of something more ancient, a curse upon the land, whispered long before the plantation rose, when the soil still bore the blood of the enslaved and dispossessed. Some said the meal was not a meal at all, but a ritual, a midnight communion where the line between feast and sacrifice was deliberately crossed. Whether one believed in curses or conspiracies, one fact could not be denied. What began as a display of wealth ended as an unsolved massacre. Historians, with their appetite for rational explanations, have often dismissed the event as exaggerated rumor, a tale woven larger with each telling. Yet oral traditions passed down quietly among families hold details too strange and too consistent to ignore. Even now, more than a century and a half later, the story refuses to rest. It lingers like the echo of a clinking glass or the faint rustle of silk gowns in an abandoned hall. What truly happened that night? Was it human malice, divine judgment, or something born from the shadows of the land itself? Tonight we revisit the haunting legend of the plantation's last midnight meal. The origins of the plantation reach back long before the year 1856, long before the midnight banquet that would cement its reputation as cursed ground. To understand what happened that night, one must first understand the land itself, for this soil was steeped in blood and ambition long before it ever bore cotton. The story begins not with wealth, but with wilderness. Low-country swamps, heavy with humidity, alive with the cries of herons and the hiss of insects. For centuries, the land was avoided by native tribes who spoke of restless spirits inhabiting its thickets, shadows that dwelled between the cypress roots and the marshes. They claimed that the earth was not meant to be cultivated, that it resisted ownership. Yet in the 18th century, when European settlers arrived with a hunger for expansion, those warnings were cast aside, dismissed as superstition from a people the colonists never intended to heed. By the mid-1700s, the land had passed into the hands of a wealthy English family, the Whitfields, who saw not danger, but opportunity. Cotton was already becoming the white gold of the South, and the Whitfields, like so many aristocratic families of their day, sought to turn the unforgiving marshland into a fortune. They brought enslaved laborers from coastal markets, forcing them to drain the swamps, clear the trees, and build the grand house that would stand as both a beacon of wealth and a fortress of cruelty. The construction itself was marked by tragedy, stories of workers vanishing in the marsh, of accidents that seemed less like chance and more like the land itself striking back. A diary belonging to one overseer described hearing chants at night, carried across the fields by the enslaved, prayers not in English but in African tongues. They sing against the house, he wrote, as if to set a curse upon it. By the time the plantation was complete, it stood as one of the largest in the Charleston region. White columns rose from a wide veranda, the windows gleamed with imported glass, and chandeliers glittered above ballrooms where guests danced until dawn. To visiting merchants, ministers, and politicians, the estate represented civilization carved out of wilderness. To those bound within its fields, it represented something else entirely. Endless labor under the lash, a place where families were torn apart, and the very earth was stained with grief. The plantation thus carried two identities from its inception, one of elegance and prosperity, another of torment and despair. That tension between beauty and brutality, between wealth and death, became the heartbeat of its legend. Local folklore began to coil around the estate even as its wealth grew. Some claimed that the family's fortune was unnatural, that no ordinary soil could yield such bountiful harvests without exacting a cost. Tales spread of enslaved people who sickened suddenly, wasting away as though drained by unseen hands. Others whispered of a girl, young, barely more than a child, who was said to have drowned in the ornamental fountain that stood before the house. Her spirit, it was said, would appear in the moonlight, hair dripping, eyes pale, lingering at the edge of the veranda before vanishing into the mist. Though no record of her death appears in official ledgers, servants insisted the girl had been real, and that the Whitfield family had hushed the tragedy to preserve their image. Despite these dark whispers, the family thrived. They entertained foreign dignitaries, invested in shipping ventures, and amassed wealth that rivaled the most established Charleston elites. Yet prosperity was built upon a fragile foundation, for it rested not on stability, but on domination and secrecy. Beneath the polished banquets and Sunday sermons, cruelty festered. Enslaved men and women recounted beatings so severe that scars never healed, punishments designed not just to discipline, but to break the spirit. Some said the patriarch, Edward Whitfield, practiced strange rituals late at night, wandering the fields with a lantern, muttering prayers that did not sound entirely Christian. A few even claimed he buried objects in the soil, coins, bones, pieces of hair, meant to bind the land's power to his own. Was this superstition, a rumor twisted from fear, or a glimpse of something the family desperately tried to conceal? The contradictions grew sharper with every passing year. Visitors saw wealth, refinement, and a family at the pinnacle of society. Yet in the slave quarters, songs were sung that told another story, songs of hunger, pain, and spirits that watched from the tree line. These oral traditions painted the plantation not as a sanctuary, but as a battlefield, where human ambition clashed against forces both natural and supernatural. Even those outside the estate could sense it. Travelers reported an oppressive quiet when passing the grounds, as though the air thickened around them. Ministers warned in cautious tones that pride and cruelty often invited divine punishment, but no warning seemed to reach the Whitfields themselves. They doubled down on their displays of dominance, hosting grander gatherings, holding longer feasts, and ensuring their reputation as untouchable aristocrats. Yet beneath that glittering surface, the cracks were widening. The plantation's history was marked by a series of unexplained deaths. In 1812, a fire claimed one of the barns, killing several workers who had been locked inside. Official reports blamed negligence. Others whispered it was intentional, a punishment disguised as accident. In 1827, Edward Whitfield's youngest son fell ill and died within days, his body covered in lesions that no doctor could identify. Some called it yellow fever. Others swore it was the curse of the land claiming another heir. The family rarely spoke of these tragedies in public, yet they seemed to accumulate, like a ledger written in blood rather than ink. By the 1830s, the estate had passed to a new generation, and with it the old whispers grew louder. Locals claimed to see strange lights on the fields at night, hovering above the rows of cotton. Travelers spoke of hearing voices in the swamp, calling their names, though no one was there. Enslaved families passed down stories of ancestors who warned that the plantation would one day consume itself, that its wealth, built upon cruelty, would collapse in fire and blood. The Whitfields dismissed these tales as nonsense, yet they could not erase them. The more they tried to present their estate as a bastion of culture and refinement, the more the rumors persisted, intertwining with the very identity of the land. This duality, prosperity and decay, innocence and cruelty, shaped everything that followed. For every ball that filled the halls with music, there was a shadowed night when screams echoed across the fields. For every guest who marveled at the grandeur of the columns, there was a laborer who collapsed under the weight of endless toil. It was as if the plantation itself embodied the conflict between surface and depth, illusion and truth. And when one examines its history closely, it becomes difficult to determine where fact ends and myth begins. By the time the fateful year of 1856 arrived, The plantation's reputation was already tarnished with whispers of curses, tragedies, and sins unspoken. Yet the Whitfield family, proud and unyielding, pressed forward. They sought to silence doubt with displays of abundance, to bury whispers under the clatter of feasts and the gleam of silverware. It was in this spirit that the midnight banquet was planned, a final act of grandeur meant to remind Charleston of their place at the pinnacle of Southern society. But in trying to drown out the past, they may have awakened it. For history has a way of returning, especially when the soil beneath one's feet has never been cleansed of blood. Thus, the origins of the plantation are not merely a story of wealth or architecture, but of contradiction. It was a place where human ambition collided with human cruelty, where the desire to control nature and people alike gave birth to whispers of curses and shadows. It was a house built to project strength yet haunted by fragility. And it is within this web of arrogance, superstition, and suffering that the legend of the last midnight meal would later unfold. To dismiss the whispers as mere folklore is to ignore the foundation upon which the story stands, a foundation of soil darkened by exploitation, ambition, and perhaps something more. The night of the banquet has been described in fragments, preserved through rumor, diaries, and the faint records that survived the passing decades. It was, by all accounts, meant to be the crowning jewel of the Whitfield family's legacy, a display not merely of wealth, but of dominance, a reminder to Charleston society that their state remained unrivaled in grandeur. The invitations themselves, embossed with golden filigree and sealed with wax, had been delivered by hand to select guests of standing, fellow planters, visiting politicians, and a handful of clergy whose blessing lent legitimacy to the spectacle. Some of the cards contained curious instructions: arrive not at sunset, as was custom, but at the stroke of midnight. In an era when darkness was feared, when nights belonged to whispers and shadows, this timing was peculiar. Yet the prestige of the Whitfields was such that no one dared to refuse. For days leading up to the gathering, the estate transformed into a theater of preparation. Carts arrived laden with delicacies not commonly found in the Carolina lowlands: oysters, imported wines, exotic fruits said to have come from the West Indies. Servants scrubbed the floors until the marble gleamed, polished silverware until it reflected candlelight like tiny stars, and arranged flowers that would wilt in the heavy August air long before dawn. The dining hall itself was a masterpiece of orchestration. At its center stretched a table long enough to seat 3 dozen, its surface gleaming under chandeliers that seemed almost too bright for the hour. Velvet drapes softened the walls, muffling sound, and the air was thick with the mingling scents of roasted meats, sugared confections, and beeswax candles. It was abundance made tangible, a scene of elegance that disguised the invisible hands who had labored in silence to create it. As the hour approached, carriages rumbled down the oak-lined drive, their lanterns swaying in the humid night. Guests emerged dressed in silks and linens, their laughter cutting through the quiet, though some admitted later that the air felt heavier than usual, as though the land itself exhaled a warning. Inside, music played softly, a quartet of strings tucked into a corner, their notes carrying both levity and unease. The guests mingled, exchanged polite greetings, and remarked on the strangeness of gathering so late. Midnight feasts were not unheard of in Europe, but in Charleston they carried the whiff of excess, of something indulgent verging on unnatural. Yet the Whitfields reassured their guests with practiced smiles, insisting it was simply a gesture of uniqueness, a celebration unlike any other. But not everything aligned with custom. Among the servants, whispers circulated of peculiar rituals that had preceded the event. In the kitchens, a cook claimed to have seen one of the Whitfieldson sprinkling something into the wine casks, not spice, not sugar, but a powder he did not recognize. In the chapel, candles were lit not in preparation for prayer but extinguished one by one, as though marking some private count, and in the center of the dining hall, at the head of the table, a single chair was left draped in black velvet. When asked, the family dismissed it as symbolic, a tribute, they said, to their ancestors. Yet its presence unsettled many, for an empty chair at a feast can signify honor, or it can signify invitation. The priest's presence did little to soothe unease. He was a man from Savannah, known more for his eccentric sermons than for orthodoxy, and his role in the evening was ambiguous. Some guests assumed he was there to bless the meal, but others later claimed he muttered prayers in Latin that were not entirely recognizable as scripture. Witnesses disagreed on his demeanor. Some said he was solemn, others that he seemed amused, as though he understood something no one else did. He moved through the hall like a shadow, blessing guests with a hand that trembled slightly, offering words too low to be heard. To some, he was a curiosity. To others, an omen. As the guests took their seats, the contrast sharpened. Laughter and conversation filled the room. Crystal glasses clinked, and plates overflowed with food that seemed endless. Yet beneath the surface, there was unease. Several guests later remarked that the toast that evening carried a strange edge, as though each word concealed another meaning, or... Gentleman raised his glass. To wealth that lasts, beyond the grave, another. To blood that binds us, tighter than kin. These were not the casual toasts of merriment. They were incantations disguised as pleasantries. The act of dining itself became almost ritualistic. Servants moved in unison, refilling goblets before they were empty, replacing plates before hunger returned. Each course arrived with precise timing, almost as though choreographed. Roasted fowl glazed to a sheen, fish dressed in herbs, fruits that bled red juice when cut. And always the wine, flowing without pause, staining lips and loosening tongues. Food has always carried symbolic weight, sustenance on one hand, indulgence on the other. To feast in such excess at such an hour, blurred the line between nourishment and offering. The psychology of power was woven into every bite. A shared table, after all, is a stage for hierarchy. Who sits where? Who is served first? Who dares to speak or remain silent? And that night, the Whitfields presided with a gravity that felt less like hospitality and more like dominion. As the hours deepened, the tone shifted. The laughter grew louder, but so too did the shadows stretch longer across the table. Guests began to notice peculiarities. A draft that extinguished candles despite closed windows. A faint ringing sound beneath the music as though the walls themselves hummed. Some swore they heard whispers, unintelligible, low, weaving between the strains of the quartet. One woman later described the sensation as though another presence had joined them at the table, unseen but palpable, seated in the chair draped in black. The priest rose at one point to speak, raising his hand as though delivering a benediction. His words, however, were strange. Some claimed he invoked blessings upon those who consume and are consumed. Others that he spoke of a feast where the living and the dead break bread as one. Whether mistranslated, misheard, or deliberately obscure, his language unsettled the guests. Yet none dared to leave, for etiquette was stronger than fear, and the weight of social expectation held them in their seats. Psychologists who later examined the event argued that this was the moment when unease transformed into collective dread. Humans, after all, are bound by rituals around food. To share a meal is to enact trust. To break bread is to form community. But when that ritual twists, when the meal feels more like a ceremony than a dinner, fear seeps in. Anthropologists note that across cultures, midnight feasts often carry associations of the supernatural, as though eating in darkness invites forces that daylight keeps at bay. The Whitfields may have intended only a spectacle, but the timing, the symbols, and the words spoken blurred the boundary between celebration and rite. And once blurred, that line is difficult to draw. Accounts diverged sharply after this point. Some guests remembered the evening continuing in merriment, with more courses and more toasts. Others recalled an oppressive silence settling over the hall, broken only by the scrape of knives and forks. One account, written in the diary of a visiting merchant, described looking down at his plate and seeing not roasted meat, but something raw, dripping, staring back at him with eyes that should not have been there. Was this a hallucination, the result of wine and suggestion? Or had perception itself been altered by something no rational explanation could cover? The servants, whose voices often went unheard in history, offered their own testimonies. One claimed he saw a shadow move across the wall though noon passed before the candles. Another swore the priest's lips continued to move long after he had stopped speaking aloud. Still another reported that when he leaned to pour wine, the goblet was already full though he'd not touched it. These details, dismissed as superstition by skeptics, nevertheless formed part of the tapestry of the night. And then there was the music. The quartet played tirelessly, their bows moving across strings, yet several guests swore the melody changed without direction. Harmonies bent, notes soured, until what began as a waltz dissolved into something discordant, almost predatory. One musician later vanished from record altogether, his name absent from payrolls as though he had never existed. What became of him, no one could say. The gathering stretched into the deepest hours of the night, suspended between feast and ritual, between abundance and menace. On the surface it was still a banquet, plates filled, goblets raised, laughter echoing. But beneath something was shifting. The psychology of the group, bent under the weight of suggestion, fear, and perhaps something more. Was it political? A clandestine meeting wrapped in spectacle? Was it a cult? A ritual disguised as celebration? Or was it simply excess collapsing under its own gravity? Whatever the truth, the gathering had crossed a threshold. It was no longer merely a dinner. It was an invocation, and when dawn approached, the hall that had glittered with wealth would instead reek of death. The gathering was not just prelude, it was the stage on which history, legend, and nightmare converged. It began with a flicker. That is what several surviving servants swore, though their testimonies were scattered and often contradictory. They said the candles, dozens of them set in silver candelabras that gleamed like captured stars, quivered all at once as if a wind had entered the great hall. Yet the doors were closed, the windows latched, the heavy curtains drawn. The laughter that had filled the room only moments earlier seemed to dim in its own echo, as though some vast hand had pressed down upon the air. For a heartbeat, silence ruled, stretching long enough that every guest seemed aware of it. And then the meal, which had been a feast of decadence and delight, transformed into a tableau of nightmare. Accounts differ on the precise moment when the horror struck. Some insist it began with a woman's scream, one of the wives seated at the far end of the table, who clutched her throat and collapsed against her plate of roasted pheasant. Others recall the sound of glass shattering, as a guest dropped his goblet, wine spilling like blood across the linen. Still others say it was quieter, a single cough, then another, then an eruption of choking, gagging, convulsing bodies as though invisible hands gripped them all at once. Within minutes, the great hall of celebration had become a chamber of death. Witnesses spoke of bodies twisting in unnatural shapes. Faces froze mid-laughter, eyes bulging wide as though fixed upon some monstrous vision unseen by others. One man's jaw locked open in a rictus grin, his teeth bared until blood trickled from the corners of his mouth. Another guest collapsed backward, his chair snapping beneath him, limbs thrashing as though he fought a battle against an enemy only he could see. Servants rushed forward but then froze in terror, for the scene unfolding was beyond comprehension. What does one do when an entire table begins to convulse, to choke, to collapse? What prayer, what medicine, what human hand could intervene? Later, in hushed voices, the enslaved people of the household described something far more sinister than mere poison. They claimed a shadow moved through the room, passing over each guest in turn. They spoke of the air growing colder, of the sound of whispering voices that did not come from mortal throats. One servant swore she saw a dark figure behind the priest, a man brought in under the guise of offering blessings, yet whose muttered words that night did not sound like scripture. Whether truth or superstition, her words echoed in every retelling. They were not alone at the table. The physician summoned afterward gave a far more rational account. He examined the corpses and concluded that poisoning was the most likely cause. The symptoms, violent convulsions, vomiting, contorted limbs, aligned with arsenic or perhaps ergot, a fungus that infects rye and can cause hallucinations and spasms. Indeed, ergot poisoning has been linked to several historical outbreaks of mass hysteria and death. But the physician's explanation failed to answer certain peculiarities. Why had some guests died almost instantly, while others lingered for hours, their bodies stiff but their eyes darting wildly as though following invisible movements? Why did no servant or slave who tasted the food suffer the same fate? And why did several of the corpses bear expressions so grotesque, so contorted, that even seasoned undertakers refused to dress them for burial? Folklore, of course, offered other explanations. Among the enslaved community, whispers spread that the land itself had taken vengeance. They spoke of old rituals, of spirits bound to the soil long before the plantation was built, spirits who fed not on food, but on fear. One tale claimed the midnight meal was, in truth, an offering gone wrong. The priest, far from blessing the gathering, had invoked forces he could not control. What entered the hall that night was not God's grace, but something older and hungrier. To the local Gula people, whose ancestors carried deep traditions from West Africa, the signs were unmistakable. The laughter that turned suddenly to silence, the cold air in a sealed room, the shadows where no candlelight could reach. These were not symptoms of poison, they argued, but of a feast claimed by the dead. Yet psychology too has a role in this story. Rituals around food have long carried a duality: nourishment and danger, communion and corruption. Anthropologists note that the dining table, especially in aristocratic circles, becomes a stage for power. Who sits where? Who is served first? Whose glass is refilled? All these gestures reinforce hierarchy. To poison a table, then, is to attack not merely bodies but the very symbol of order and control. Could it be that one guest, seeking revenge or inheritance, orchestrated the massacre to shatter the illusion of invulnerability? Perhaps. But this does not explain the accounts of chanting, of whispered toasts that shifted from blessings to something darker. Several guests raised their glasses that night not merely to wealth but to eternity. The line between political gathering and occult ritual is thinner than many dare admit. One particularly haunting testimony came from a young servant girl, barely 13, who had been tasked with carrying wine from the cellar. She later told investigators that, as she ascended the steps, she heard laughter inside the hall, but it was not the laughter of celebration. It was sharp, jagged, as if multiple voices laughed in perfect unison, overlapping in a way that no human choir could replicate. She froze, the wine trembling in her hands, until the sound ceased. When she entered, the guests were silent, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the priest at the head of the table. He raised his hand, muttered something she did not understand, and then smiled. Minutes later, chaos erupted. Her words, recorded in fragments, were dismissed as the imaginings of a frightened child. Yet they persist in the oral history of the event, a chilling reminder that sometimes the youngest see most clearly. As the night unfolded, the house itself seemed to turn against its masters. Doors that had been open slammed shut of their own accord. Candles sputtered, plunging corners of the hall into sudden darkness. Some guests tried to flee, staggering toward the exits but collapsed before they reached the doors. Others clawed at their throats as though strangled by invisible fingers. And when at last silence returned, the hall was transformed. Plates of untouched food sat cooling beside the twisted corpses of their diners. Goblets of wine reflected the dim glow of dying candles. Chairs lay overturned, silverware scattered, as though the room itself recoiled from what it had witnessed. In the days that followed, theories multiplied. Some pointed to political motives. Perhaps an enemy of the plantation's owner had arranged the deaths, slipping arsenic into the wine as an act of vengeance. Others suspected disputes over inheritance, for several wealthy heirs sat among the dead, their fortunes now left in limbo. Yet others whispered of forbidden rituals, of secret societies that met under the guise of banquets but sought communion with darker forces. The presence of the priest, whose name was curiously absent from parish records, fueled speculation. Was he truly a man of God, or had he come bearing another scripture entirely? Science and superstition clashed fiercely in the aftermath. Doctors insisted on natural causes, though no definitive toxin was ever proven. Clergymen denounced whispers of curses, yet could not explain why sacred prayers spoken in the house afterward faltered on the tongue, as if the air itself resisted the words. Folklore filled the silence left by unsatisfying rationality. Tales spread of guests who continued to appear in the dining hall long after their burial, figures glimpsed in candlelight, seated at the table, raising empty glasses in a toast to no one. Workers refused to enter the hall at night, claiming the sound of silverware clinking still echoed in the darkness. What then truly killed those gathered at the last midnight meal? Was it arsenic, carefully placed by a human hand seeking revenge? Was it ergot, an accidental poisoning born of contaminated grain? Or was it something far less tangible? A curse woven into the soil, a spirit awakened by arrogance, a ritual gone disastrously wrong. The truth remained suspended between science and superstition, between logic and fear. Perhaps the guests died of poison. Perhaps they glimpsed something no mortal should ever see. The bodies that night bore both the evidence of biology and the imprint of terror, a fusion of explanations that resists closure. And so the great hall remains haunted, not merely by ghosts but by questions. The dining table, once a symbol of wealth and mastery, became an altar of death. The silverware tarnished, the crystal shattered, yet the legend endured, carried on whispers, andretellings. Some say that if you enter the hall at midnight and sit at the table, you will hear the faint sound of laughter not your own, laughter that comes from empty chairs. Others claim that no poison could explain the look frozen on those faces, the look of eyes widened not by pain, but by revelation, as if they had gazed upon something vast, terrible, and eternal. What feasted with them that night? Was it death itself, seated unseen among the guests? Was it vengeance rising from the earth, reclaiming what was stolen? Or was it merely the folly of men and women whose hunger for power blinded them to the dangers they summoned? These questions echo louder than any answer, for answers would bring comfort, and comfort was forever banished from that hall. The last midnight meal remains a story not of death alone, but of terror at the table. Terror so deep it still unsettles those who whisper its name. Survival, in the aftermath of horror, does not always feel like a gift. Sometimes it feels like a curse, an unwanted inheritance that lingers longer than death itself. When dawn broke over the plantation in August of 1856, the dining hall was heavy with silence, its once proud banquet table now a grotesque stage of twisted bodies, spilled wine, and food untouched. Yet not every seat was accounted for, though half the guests lay dead in unnatural poses, and others were never seen again. A small handful escaped the night alive. Their voices, fractured and inconsistent, remain the only testimony of what truly unfolded. And yet when pieced together, their stories do not clarify the mystery. They fracture it further, scattering truth and illusion into 1,000 broken shards. The first of these survivors was a woman named Eleanor Hartwell, a cousin of the plantation's owner. She was found wandering the grounds just before sunrise, barefoot, her gown torn, muttering phrases that few could understand. When pressed for details, she spoke only of a shadow at the head of the table. She insisted it was no man, no priest, but something taller, darker, with eyes like burning coals. She said it had smiled as the candles flickered and that every guest who locked eyes with it froze, unable to scream. Her testimony terrified listeners but also drew skepticism. Trauma, after all, has a way of distorting memory. Was Eleanor recounting what she saw, or what her mind, shattered by fear, invented to explain the inexplicable? 4 years she never deviated from that story. Yet as her life continued, she became a recluse, avoiding gatherings, dining only alone, refusing to sit at tables larger than one. Another survivor, a young servant named Samuel, offered a very different account. He swore not that a shadow sat at the table, but that the food itself bled. As he carried platters to the guests, he claimed he saw the roasted meat pulse as if alive, blood seeping from beneath the brown skin. He dropped a dish in terror and was struck by his overseer. Yet when the panic spread moments later, his words seemed to take on new weight. Years afterward, Samuel repeated this tale to others, insisting that the banquet had been cursed from the start, the feast transfigured into sacrifice. Historians, however, question his story. Perhaps his imagination was sharpened by hunger and exhaustion. Perhaps he saw spilled wine or candle wax and, in the chaos, transformed it into something far more grotesque. Trauma blurs the line between perception and invention, and Samuel's story walks that razor's edge. A third figure, rarely mentioned in official records, was a woman named Annabeth Crowell. She survived but spoke nothing of the night. Not once, not in private letters, not even on her deathbed decades later. Family members recalled that she'd freeze at the sound of clinking glasses, her face paling at the sight of candlelit dinners. But silence was her only response to inquiry. Historians often point to her silence as the most telling detail of all. For in refusing to shape the story, Annabeth denied others the comfort of interpretation. Did she remain silent because she saw something too horrific to describe? Or because she knew the truth was more mundane, a truth bound to shame, scandal, or betrayal, that silence better concealed? In trauma studies, silence is often as revealing as speech. It shields the mind, but it also conceals guilt. Then there are the disappearances, those who walked away from Thedable and were never seen again. Their names appear in guest lists but not in burial records. Some argue they fled, fearing implication in whatever crime had transpired. Others whisper that they were taken, consumed, not by poison but by whatever force moved through that hall. In the folklore that grew afterward, these vanished souls were said to wander the plantation grounds, trapped between life and death, their hunger unending. Rational voices counter that they likely fled the South altogether, unwilling to be tied to a massacre. But absence leaves fertile ground for imagination. Every missing name becomes a canvas for legend, every silence a stage for ghosts. Psychologists who later studied the accounts noted how trauma can fragment memory. Under extreme fear, the brain does not record events in neat sequences. Instead, it shatters them into vivid fragments. A sound here, a smell there, a vision frozen like a painting. Survivors of war, disaster, and massacre often recall moments that defy logic, impossible details etched by panic. Eleanor's shadow, Samuel's bleeding food, Annabeth's silence. Each, perhaps, was the brain's attempt to translate terror into imagery. Yet what unsettles is how these images resonate with archetypes older than memory. The shadow at the table echoes the figure of death itself, seated among the living. The bleeding food recalls sacrificial rituals where the meal becomes the victim. Thessalence mirrors the age-old truth that some horrors can never be spoken without being relived. Trauma may distort, but it may also reveal truths that reason dares not articulate. Historians, meanwhile, confront another question. Were these accounts shaped less by memory and more by politics? Survivors had much to lose or to gain in the aftermath. Land, inheritance, and reputation all hung in the balance. to claim that a curse struck Thedable might absolve human guilt, protecting families from suspicion of deliberate poisoning. To invent supernatural horrors might serve as both explanation and distraction. Conversely, silence, like Annabeth's, might conceal knowledge of betrayal, perhaps even complicity. The stories that emerged in the days after the massacre were not spoken into a vacuum. They were shaped by fear of scandal, by desire for power, and by the human instinct to protect oneself at all costs. What complicates the matter further is how quickly folklore consumed fact. Within weeks, local newspapers had already distorted details, printing rumors of phantom figures and rituals. Neighbors whispered of demons invited into the dining hall, while others dismissed the entire story as hysteria. Oral traditions grew richer with each retelling. By the time the century turned, Eleanor's shadow had become a towering demon. Samuel's bleeding food had become a heart still beating on a silver platter. And Annabeth's silence had become proof of an unholy vow. The line between survivor testimony and legend blurred beyond recognition. Yet even stripped of embellishment, the survivors' stories raise profound questions about innocence and evil. Were these men and women victims of a force beyond their comprehension, or were they perpetrators of darker crimes, cloaking their guilt in the guise of curses? If poison was used, who administered it and why? If rituals were performed, who consented and who resisted? Survivors may have distorted the truth not only out of trauma, but out of complicity. Perhaps Eleanor's shadow was a metaphor for a human killer she dared not name. Perhaps Samuel's bleeding food was his conscience, recoiling at blood already spilled in other ways on the plantation. Perhaps Annabeth's silence was not fear but protection, of someone she loved, or of a legacy too dangerous to reveal. From a psychological perspective, repression becomes central. Survivors often push unbearable memories deep into the unconscious, only for them to resurface in nightmares, in symbols, in inexplicable behaviors. Eleanor's obsession with dining alone, Samuel's fixation on the bleeding feast, Annabeth's refusal to speak, all may be symptoms of unresolved trauma. But repression also distorts the historical record. What we inherit are fragments, shadows of shadows, and in trying to reconstruct the truth, we find ourselves grasping at images rather than facts. This, perhaps, is why the story of the plantation's last meal endures. Not because it can be solved, but because it resists solution, embodying the very nature of memory under fear. Vivid, haunting, contradictory, eternal. For every survivor who spoke, countless others remained silent, whether from death, disappearance, or fear. Their absence haunts the narrative as much as any presence. Silence leaves questions unasked, unanswerable, festering in the void. And yet silence also gives the legend its power. If every survivor had spoken plainly, perhaps historians would now file the event neatly under poisonings of the 19th century. Instead, we are left with shadows, blood, and silence. Three images that have outlasted time, that continue to echo in academic debates and fireside stories alike. What did the survivors truly see that night? Was Eleanor's shadow a hallucination born of arsenic or ergot poisoning, or a glimpse of something beyond human? Did Samuel really watch food bleed, or did his starving imagination translate spilled wine into horror? Did Annabeth's silence shield her from reliving trauma, or conceal a truth too dangerous to voice? These questions do not find answers. They multiply, lingering in the air like the scent of extinguished candles. In the end, the survivors of the last midnight meal did not clarify the mystery. They deepened it. Their words and silences alike became threads in a tapestry that no historian can unravel. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the banquet. Not the deaths, not the missing, not even the grotesque spectacle of twisted bodies, but the way those who lived became prisoners of memory. For to survive horror is not to escape it. It is to carry it forward, reshaped in fragments, until it becomes legend. It is often said that when the truth refuses to surface, legends rush in to fill the void. The massacre at the midnight banquet left behind more questions than bodies. And in that uncertainty, a multitude of theories were born. Some grounded in science and politics, others soaked in folklore and superstition. To this day, the story of the plantation's last feast remains suspended between competing narratives, inheritance disputes, poison, curses, rituals, and mass hysteria. Each theory seeks to impose order upon chaos, but none provides full resolution. The more one investigates, the more elusive certainty becomes. The first and perhaps most rational explanation lies in the whispers of inheritance disputes. The plantation was not merely a home but a fortress of wealth, land, and power. Family rivalries simmered just beneath the surface, sharpened by the promise of fortunes that could shift with a single death. In letters recovered decades later, Vague references to the banquet settling matters once and for all appear. Could the feast have been a stage for murder disguised as celebration? Arsenic, after all, was a poison both accessible and popular in the 19th century, undetectable at the time and easily slipped into wine. Historians who favor this theory argue that the grotesque convulsions of the victims align with classic symptoms of arsenic poisoning: abdominal agony, vomiting, and seizures. Yet, even this logical approach stumbles upon inconsistencies. Why would half the guests die while others vanished without trace? Why was there no attempt to cover the crime discreetly, as most inheritance murders were carefully orchestrated to appear natural? The spectacle of terror, the sheer theatricality of the deaths, feels less like a crime of greed and more like a ritual of punishment. This brings us to the second theory, the curse. Long before the plantation rose in columns and grandeur, the soil itself carried a legacy of blood. Enslaved people, forced to till the land under Thelash, whispered of spirits that lingered beneath the earth. Folklore tells of rituals conducted in secret, charms buried at crossroads, and invocations to ancestors for vengeance. In this narrative, the banquet was not just a meal but the culmination of centuries of cruelty, a night when the earth itself demanded retribution. Oral traditions passed down through generations claim that the ground beneath the dining hall was once the site of unmarked graves, shallow pits where those who succumbed to exhaustion or punishment were discarded. If true, the midnight feast occurred atop bones, turning laughter and music into an invitation for restless spirits. Believers in this version point to the survivors' testimony of a shadow at the head of the table. Was it merely trauma reshaping perception? Or was it a vision of ancestral wrath manifesting in the room? A third theory straddles the line between religion and sacrilege. According to some accounts, the priest present that night was not simply a spiritual guest but the orchestrator of a ritual. The feast may have been staged as a kind of communion, twisted into something dark. Wine becomes blood, bread becomes flesh, symbols inverted into instruments of damnation. Religious historians point to obscure sects and breakaway congregations of the era that flirted with apocalyptic beliefs, merging Christian scripture with esoteric practices. In this interpretation, the convulsions and deaths were less about poison and more about blasphemy, a divine punishment for mocking sacred rites. Some even argue that the survivors' silence stems not from trauma, but from complicity. Their refusalto confess participation in a ritual that went fatally wrong. Yet psychology offers another path of explanation, one rooted not in curses or rituals, but in the fragility of human perception under stress. Mass hysteria, though often dismissed as a relic of superstition, has left an undeniable mark on history. The Salem witch trials, for instance, began with a handful of girls convulsing and accusing others under the sway of fear. Could the midnight banquet have followed a similar pattern? If a single guest succumbed to foodborne illness, perhaps or got contaminated bread triggering hallucinations and spasms, the sight of their suffering might have spread panic like wildfire. Fear itself, contagious and overwhelming, could have rippled through the guests until bodies collapsed not from poison, but from psychological shock. In this scenario, the vanishing survivors did not disappear mysteriously but fled into the night, unwilling to face the shame of having succumbed to terror. Their silence afterward may have been less about secrecy and more about the inability to confront their own vulnerability. But even psychology, armed with theories of hysteria and trauma, cannot explain everything. The sheer violence of the deaths, the grotesque descriptions of eyes bulging, limbs twisting, and mouths frozen in screams, resist easy categorization. Skeptics counter that memories are unreliable, that servants and slaves, traumatized, terrified, and bound by oppression, may have reshaped their testimonies to fit expectations of supernatural punishment. Historians add another layer, suggesting that the legend itself was politically useful. By framing the plantation as cursed, local communities could both condemn and distance themselves from its legacy of cruelty. The legend became a vessel for collective guilt, a way to speak of horrors indirectly, cloaked in mystery rather than blunt reality. Theories, however, are not confined to academics or folklore. Families connected to the plantation spun their own narratives, often self-serving. Some descendants insisted the tragedy was an exaggerated tale meant to tarnish their name. Others embraced the legend of the curse, as if romanticizing the horror could elevate their ancestry into something mythic. Competing versions of the event circulated in newspapers of the late 19th century, one describing deliberate poisoning, another detailing a phantom presence, yet another framing it as a mysterious malady. The inconsistencies reveal not only the fragility of truth, but also the hunger for spectacle. The more shocking the tale, the more it endured. At its heart, the mystery of the midnight banquet is less about what truly happened, and more about how humans grapple with the unknown. Science seeks tangible causes: arsenic, ergot, hysteria. Folklore clings to spirits and curses. Religion demands interpretation through sin and punishment. And psychology reminds us that the human mind, under pressure, can invent terrors more vivid than reality itself. Perhaps the tragedy lies in the intersection of all these forces: greed that poisoned relationships, cruelty that sowed curses into the soil, faith warped into ritual, and fear that magnified every shadow. As the years stretched into decades, the story hardened into legend, unyielding to rational inquiry. Visitors claimed to hear whispers in the dining hall, as if voices still argued over their final toasts. Candles would flicker inexplicably, though no draft stirred. Some swore that when seated at the table, one felt a sudden chill, as though invisible eyes stared from the head chair. Were these mere tricks of imagination, fed by the legend, or subtle echoes of something unresolved? Even now, scholars argue not over what is true, but over why the story endures. Myths, after all, serve purposes. They warn, they explain, they preserve memory in symbolic form. The banquet's legend, with all its contradictions, forces us to confront questions about human nature. Do we fear death more when it comes through betrayal, or when it arrives inexplicably shrouded in mystery? Are we more haunted by the possibility of supernatural punishment, or by the idea that human cruelty alone suffices to create hell on earth? The Plantation's final feast has become a mirror, reflecting whatever terrors the observer brings to it. To the historian, it is a case study in greed and inheritance disputes. To the folklorist, it is evidence of ancestral vengeance. To the theologian, it is a blasphemous ritual punished by divine wrath. To the psychologist, it is a mass trauma refracted through memory. And to the ordinary listener, it is simply a ghost story, one that grips the imagination because it cannot be neatly solved. In the end, theories and legends swirl together like smoke over the extinguished candles of that night. Each version offers fragments, but none delivers certainty. Perhaps the truth lies buried in unmarked graves, dissolved in forgotten letters, or locked forever in the silence of those who fled. Perhaps there was no single truth at all, only overlapping layers of fear, violence, and belief that fused into the legend we know today. And so, the midnight banquet remains not only a historical puzzle but also a parable. It warns of ambition's cost, of cruelty's echo, of faith distorted, and of fear's power to consume. Whether born of poison, curse, ritual, or hysteria, the legend endures because it speaks to a universal truth: that evil, whether human or supernatural, thrives in the shadows between certainty and doubt. And it is in those shadows, perhaps, that the guests of the Plantation still sit, frozen forever at their last meal, waiting for someone brave or foolish, enough to ask the one question that no theory can fully answer: what truly happened at the table that night? Time, it is often said, buries all wounds beneath its soil, but the Plantation resists burial. Though its columns have crumbled, and its dining hall lies open to the sky, strangled by vines and consumed by rot, the memory of the midnight banquet has not faded. Instead, it has grown stronger, more insistent, as if the ruins themselves whisper the story to those who wander too close. What once was a monument to wealth and ambition now stands as a skeletal reminder of something far darker, an unanswered question carved into the land. Official records of the tragedy remain frustratingly thin. Courthouse ledgers and local death registries mark a night of loss but avoid the specifics, as though naming the horror would risk unleashing it again. Diaries recovered from nearby estates mention the banquet only in fragments: a hurried line about terrible news, a half-written entry ending mid-sentence, ink smeared as if the hand that wrote it trembled too violently to continue. The silences in the archives speak louder than any account, suggesting fear strong enough to erase memory itself. And yet, outside of officialdom, the legend thrives. Tourists who walk the grounds today often report the same chilling detail. At the stroke of midnight, the air grows unnaturally still. The buzz of insects falls silent, owls cease their cries, and the breeze seems to hold its breath. Some insist they hear the clink of crystal glasses, as though a phantom toast is raised just beyond sight. Others swear faint laughter drifts through the air, playful at first, then hollow, unraveling into something more like a death rattle than a chuckle. Skeptics dismiss such claims as the product of suggestion, stories planted in the imagination before footsteps ever touched the ruined soil. Yet the persistence of these accounts, spanning generations, suggests something more than coincidence. Interpretations, as ever, are divided. Some historians argue that the legend is simply morality cloaked in ghost story, a symbolic reckoning for the cruelty, exploitation, and blood that fueled the plantation's wealth. Others frame it as a psychological puzzle, proof of how trauma and guilt can echo across centuries, distorting memory until it becomes myth. Still others embrace the supernatural, claiming the curse of the land has never lifted, that the dead remain restless because justice was never served. Each explanation reveals more about those who tell it than about the event itself. And so the deeper mystery remains. Was the midnight meal an act of vengeance carried out with poison? Was it an accident of spoiled food transformed by hysteria into something monstrous? Or was it, as some whisper, a glimpse into a realm humanity cannot yet name? A moment when the veil thinned and something unearthly sat down at the table. Perhaps the truth perished with those who convulsed and vanished into silence. Or perhaps, like the faint ring of silverware against porcelain, it lingers still, waiting patiently for those brave or reckless enough to listen.